Okay, I'm going to give exactly the same talk, but as the modern Major General says, this time really fast. We're facing two major crises in democratic market societies, a dramatic increase in inequality of which we are a particularly extreme version, and a rise of ethno-nationalism, of ethno-national authoritarianism emerging across the world, both in democratic and non-democratic, both in advanced and non-advanced countries. And when we ask the question, why are you so down, as it was asked this morning, about what has happened, it's when you live in a country in which the only population in the entire developed world that has seen mortality rates rise is US white population, and you live in a context of a proto-fascist success in an election, you can't sit happy. We did okay with the internet. So what's technology got to do with it? The dominant economic model of the last 30 years has been skills-biased technical change. It is the foundational intellectual structure around the robots will eat all the jobs and platforms will destroy everything. And it sees technology as deterministically influencing markets that are themselves each exogenous to the other. So old-style skills-biased technical change starts with product markets and labor markets that are roughly efficient. Technology changes the relative productivity of skills, which then differentiates across models, across values. This one assumed monotonically increasing return to education and was correct, developed in the 90s, correct for the 80s. The 90s didn't look the same because people in the middle lost rather than people at the bottom and the top. So a new theory version was developed, the task framework, which is the intellectual template of robots, and that's that our routine and non-routine and cognitive and non-cognitive work. And routine work is what the middle class does, and that can get automated. Again, notice critically, the markets are all efficient. Everything happens on the outside. The problem with that is it fit the 90s, but not the 80s and what's happened since 2000. It fit the US in the 90s, but not Germany and other countries in the same technological frontier. Again, we have a new version of it in the 2010s. It's a little bit in trouble. So instead, it's institutions. The best version of SBTC, of the classical SBTC, is Golden and Katz, and it does see institutions, but notice specifically it's about education policy. The market remains largely efficient. Technology and skills are largely, technology and markets are largely exogenous to each other, and institutions play in the distribution of skills. By contrast, throughout this period, there's been a lot of work in labor economics that sees markets as primarily arenas of power structured by institutions, and the critical econometrically measured dynamics of inequality are union decline, minimum wage laws, that is, state political power through minimum wage laws, union power, and how it implements through political and norms power, macroeconomic policy that's more focused on inflation as opposed to on full employment. Interesting about all of this that it gives a minimal role to technology. One gives too much of a role to technology, one gives not enough of a role to technology. So what is the story that we are telling that could be both? I'll just highlight, let's not forget, and then there's the Hacker and Pearson component from winner-take-all politics, which essentially also locates the institutional change and the fundamental transformation in the 70s and the rise of organized business, the Chamber of Commerce, the rise of, and the Business Roundtable, and the rise of lobbying that then pushed the institutions that created this inequality. Again, a minimal role for technology. A big project I'm working on now is trying to excavate from the 70s how we connect technology to this, and this will connect to the future. So a version of the story is in the 60s. This is essentially relative education and relative wage in the financial industry. A big story is that in the 60s and 70s, you see a dramatic set of innovations in theories of finance. They do not get reduced to actual practice until PCs get in, at which point you get the LBOs and the CDOs that really jump things up, and then later on algorithmic trading. The limitation, so this is a story in which technology is a critical enabling tool set with which to implement within a possibility set. But the same exact correlation also occurs with regard to deregulation. And so we know the standard story of neoliberalism, the Reagan moment, etc. But there's also what happens in the 60s and 70s is a shift in the left. So Ralph Nader and the Nader Raiders are as important as Stigler and the Virginia School in introducing the idea of agency capture and questioning the possibility of effective markets. The rise of self-actualization and individual is as important as rational actor theory and the neoliberal version to focus things on the individual as opposed to on the solidaristic. So we see the combination of a shift in ideology and law allowing a certain way to happen with the technology, and at the same time also mixing with what we saw with executive compensation, which also has an inflection point at exactly the same time. And while there's great work from Bedchik and Fried and others showing that this was not about efficiency and could not be explained by the new technologies that allowed for more efficient and expanded control over systems, the timing is best explained by social norms. You've got Holmstrom and Kaplan talking about LBO norms. You've got Khurana talking about managerial market norms. You've got Western and Rosenfeld talking about unions and norms. There's a major managerial norm change here. Part of what I've been adding to this is looking at knowledge changes. This is also the time at which high-end knowledge invents the legitimating ideas of shareholder value and agency theory that actually justify a certain mode that brings executive compensation in line with the S&P 500. Essentially what you get is knowledge and popular culture creating a set of normative changes. This is a spaghetti ball you don't really need to read in details. Connecting with politics and law that feed both into financial markets and managerial markets, and together create a shift, a fundamental shift in labor markets, and push both the affordances of social, the technology into a model of disinvestment from labor and financialization. To abstract from that, think of it as a dynamic between ideology, technology, and institutions that primarily focuses on power over economy, polity, kinship, and culture, whose primary project is about fighting over power over the magnitude, the defensibility, and the bargaining power over the rents, if it's in the economy, the influence, if it's in other systems of power. And it's played across technology, institutions, and knowledge. Any one of you who's seen investment in studies of any subject you've looked at, you will understand the fight over knowledge, with feedback loops and punctuated equilibria. That's the basic model reduced. So if you look at 46 to 70, you see the technologies of the assembly line of electrification, internal combustion, etc., fitting into high modernism and the idea and the epistemology of standardization and expertise, and managerialism, Taylorism, Fordism, etc., the administrative state. We know this story. We also know, and I've already mentioned both the left and the right version of choice in free markets, rational actor theory, but also self-actualization, pluralist egalitarianism, etc., how these fit with a particular set of technologies in production that allowed both for globalization and for financialization, and a set of values about institutions that are so embedded that we saw them this afternoon in the first panel, still talking about the limitations of regulation. Critically, it didn't happen the same way in all countries. All countries at the same technological frontier did not have the same mode of liberalization. All did have increase in information, all did have liberalization, but they worked in different ways with different effects. So that in effect, the period we're talking about, the period in which digital tornado comes out, is this period at the height of the neoliberal moment, at the height of pluralist oligarchy as the reigning ideology and the reigning institutional structure. And that period reflects it, and reflects it obviously most clearly in the techno-libertarian version. Let's give Barlow his due. Basically, and the Silicon Valley sense of leave us. So it's essentially, it's leave us be, and technology will eliminate scarcity. What happened, which Tim was sort of pushing back when Neva was asking him, was the emergence of a set of practices, free and open source software, the success of the Internet Engineering Task Force, etc., that created the possibility of a new epistemology and a new way of knowing the world, which you can think of as C.S. Purser's fallibilism, the idea of knowledge as practice, knowledge in communities of practice, which we all feel in our fingers when we say things like rough consensus and running code, late binding design, loosely coupled systems, release early, release often, but also in the Agile Manifesto. It's not just about what's outside of the business. This a basic idea that things are inherently fallible. This is true of both the state and the market. That's the critical difference from the neoliberal moment that was also skeptical about planned systems, was the rejection of price systems as themselves infallible, and the acceptance of the possibility of non-market models. So many of us cut our teeth on these battles, and I look at all the faces that are of old friends and familiar friends. We've all fought these battles around commons and property and opens and closed on both sides of them, played out in IP, in privacy, in telecoms, in spectrum, in encryption. This was the core battle of the time because it was possible. It was possible because the technological stack and the multi-system stack lined up on open models. So you had a social cultural battle of the netheads versus the bellheads, organizationally the IETF, W3C, FOSS, the technical layer of TCP, IP, and HTML and the open APIs. The law happened to be common carrier because it was over copper. Antitrust was still playing, unbundling at this time was still playing, and succeeded in Europe. One thing nobody talked about today is the Europeans see the unbundling as a success there. We only think we have not 4, 1.5 competitors. We don't have 4. We just have 4 companies, each of which is a regional monopoly. And markets were all open, so that it wasn't the antitrust case that created Firefox. It was the combination, perhaps, of the antitrust, but fundamentally, the conceptual capability of turning the code over from Netscape that was no longer viable to a free and open source community development project, which would have been inconceivable 5 years earlier when the antitrust case was brought. So we have this shift from industrial information production to networked information production across multiple vectors. And what happened in the 2010s is that there's all been reconcentrated into platforms. And you have an inversion of the structure without an inversion of the content production system. You have a centralized structure across all of these. Essentially what we're seeing is, if you think of Tiananmen Square just before, all of these prize-winning photos look exactly the same because they're all from where the reporters were allowed to sit. By contrast, when you look at Egyptian tank man from the Arab Spring, if you look at the foundational change of American debate over the killing of black men by police officers, these were fundamentally about an inversion and democratization, which is still there, of the capacity to set the agenda. We saw the ethic of suddenly I'm living here, in the case of Philando Castile, of broadcasting live. And then within a few months, it turns out Facebook has an off switch that the police can call. And we suddenly understood the concentration, and as of the last election, Facebook becomes the epicenter of the epistemic crisis in which we find ourselves. What's happened? The technological stack completely changed. Not that TCP isn't there, not that Spectrum Commons hasn't worked, not that HTML isn't there yet, but around them, below and above, the smartphone became the core computational device, which then shifted to wireless companies, which then created the first platform as an app store model, the cloud services, and above that. We saw then, after this was copied, the effort for Windows 10 to move to an app store model and the development around that. It completely changed the institutional system that interacted with it, ranging from social cultural moves, as Bruce Schneier puts it, with fear and convenience driving as the framework of an incapable consumer instead of an active user and co-developer and co-creator, The organizational system is all internal. The technical system is all proprietary standards and DRM. The law of voluntary enforcement, EULAs, etc. And the market is that tippy market with a complete orientation towards security and customer service. That's for me. I have so much time. Whew, who knew? Like I said, this time faster. I didn't copy this from Julie. It was right up here, and this is a PDF sign. Rent-seeking sees openness as damage and routes around it. That's, I think, what we both are trying to capture as a lesson that we didn't have a decade ago, was the extent to which you could win the battles at what we thought were the critical infrastructural choke points and still lose because around them new points of control would develop, new organizational and social models would emerge, and they would then capture the system. And of course, this is before we add the critical thing that is absolutely critical, which is data, as Victor was talking about earlier. And essentially, critically here, again, just echoing what Victor said earlier, the incumbents are now controlling troves which become the non-replicable infrastructure around which everything else moves. It becomes the local loop. And then the question is, do we know how to work with the local loop? We have some experience. But again, you have data-driven marketing and data-driven management, critical to machine learning and AI, and the other major ideological move is the move in the behavioral sciences to understand experimentally based large-scale manipulation of behavior as the critical additional thing we know how to do. So this then ripples through the entire system. It ripples through systems for the control of material processes, which then impact both labor and the movement of physical things. This is probably not going to be Facebook, though it might be Alphabet. They're certainly going there. This is about data becoming the critical infrastructure for control over all the physical processes. The networked organization is not new. Castells wrote about it 20 years ago as a phenomenon that was already there for 20 years. But we're seeing it increased and expanded much more broadly. We're seeing reputation and trust, supply and demand availability, and critically experimentally informed, behaviorally managed monopsony and monopoly pricing in both labor and services market. Shoshana's sitting there, that's surveillance capitalism. That's the critical aspect of it. We're sitting here with rich individualized data and behavioral marketing, creating fine-grained manipulations of beliefs, preferences, understood possibilities of constraints and actions, which is to say, acts. Where's Brett on programmable people? This is what we're talking about. Essentially, we have incumbent platforms that exercise increasing amounts of power by controlling their existing troves over both competing platforms on the same technology, competitors trying to replace them. Gigi was talking about Snap earlier, as you were, Tim, on your panel. Innovators on incumbent platforms themselves, that's the relationship. Sellers on two-sided markets, workers in labor markets, both, if you think Williamson, both discipline and price are fully susceptible now to control by one-sided unequal bargaining power. And the fundamental challenge to all the idea of a market liberal society comes from the fact that we depend for liberal markets on the idea of welfare, that is to say, people exogenously know what they want, and then markets do or don't deliver. That's how we know what we know. But if you endogenize demand, it's an incoherent idea. The entire discipline of economics is like the coyote in Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff. They're giving Thaler the Nobel Prize, and they don't see that the whole concept of exogenous preferences is gone. There is no such thing as welfare to maximize when it is endogenous to the market. And what this election has told us is that the same thing may be happening to citizenship. The possibility of self-governance in a pluralist society by the aggregation of preferences of free citizens is impossible when what they want is itself the product of the system in which we're in. When manufacturing of consent and manufacturing of public belief is the central object. So this comes from a project we just did in my research team using 2 million stories from the 18 months before the election. And the thing I want to draw your attention to, more than anything else, is the asymmetry. Technology is not destiny. Technology is not giving us fake news. Norms, institutions, practices enabled by technology are doing it. What we're seeing on the right and what we're seeing in the center left, and the left is not the same. This is the land that started with Rush Limbaugh after the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated. This is the land that Fox News built in '96. And when you bring Russians, or white supremacists on 4chan, or Cambridge Analytica, to an already asymmetric political, social sphere, you get asymmetry. And essentially we're seeing these 4 major suspects in what's happened to us. Russia, this is the point Neva was raising about state actors being absolutely central. We see the work on the extreme right wing, the white supremacists on 4chan and Reddit, as notes here, distributed, not centralized. We're seeing the information polluters, essentially commercial practices, this is fake news, people who don't care about politics are only trying to build something commercially and produce epistemic crisis as pollution, and Breitbart, Mercer, Fox News, the Trump campaign, this beautiful quote from Bannon when he joined the campaign. I wouldn't have come aboard, even for Trump, if I hadn't known they were building this massive Facebook and data engine. Facebook is what propelled Breitbart to a massive audience. We know its power. The idea that you can harness these firms to create a level of manipulation of public opinion never before possible becomes the combination between the centralizing and the decentralizing. So essentially we have these 4 suspects, and believe me, at the moment, I think as a matter of data, we don't know the comparative contribution of each to the crisis we find ourselves in. It might be centralized state actors who are politically oriented completely. It might be fully decentralized white supremacist mobs trying to do it. It might be commercial actors who don't care about politics and are just spewing nonsense as pollution. Or it might be this mix of political, commercial model that we might think of as Ailes and Murdoch and Bannon and Mercer playing this role and leveraging the data capabilities of Google and Facebook. But these are the sources of our epistemic crisis, and this is where we need to look for them. What did I do wrong? Sorry about that. I'll toll my limitations. These are the no-exit companies. There's no exit. Voice is highly manipulable, and regulation is limited. Essentially, to conclude, what we have here is a moment where a class of technologies has hit a particular moment where our regulatory framework is definitely still stuck in the techno-libertarian fear. We have a resurgent economic nationalism with a corporatist idea about how to govern economy, but a fundamentally an oligarchic and authoritarian structure being pushed across the world as if we don't do this right, this is where we'll end up, at least some of us. That to me is what's pushing. I think my mistake, the mistake of those who thought like me and me, was the inability to predict the extent of the power that could happen around the social and distributed models, the failure modes of social production alongside the failure modes of the market, that social production was not immune to fallibilism any more than markets or state were. And so we need some kind of solution that involves the state, municipalities, more traditional organizations, and networks together with these distributed models. And then this question of where the state will come in, with nudge progressively being one model, let's just give us data and have better government, but really torn between these two competing ideologies. One that still wants to keep the government relatively small and project out to market actors, and the other that tries to build a more socially embedded, coming back to Polanyi, a more socially embedded organization, something that's more like Barcelona than Amsterdam in thinking of the relationship between a municipality and the sharing economy around it.